At night, Peppa opened her eyes. The house felt strange. The ceiling was cracked, the walls were damp, and the air was heavy and cold. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled, but it sounded wrong, like someone whispering. George was sitting nearby. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, staring into the dark. "George, what's wrong?" Peppa asked. He silently pointed toward the door. A dim light flickered in the hallway. Peppa carefully climbed down from her bed and followed her brother. The house was empty. There were no smells of Mummy Pig's cooking. The TV in the living room was off, and beyond the windows there was no garden, only endless fog. They walked slowly. The floorboards creaked under their feet and water dripped from the ceiling. When Peppa opened the bathroom door, she froze. Where the mirror used to hang, there was now a door, narrow, blue, as if painted right onto the tiles. "It wasn't here before," Peppa whispered. George stepped closer, reached out his little hoof, and touched the handle. The door opened. No creak, no sound. Just silently swung inward into a thick blue darkness. A cold draft came from within. George stepped through without looking back. The door closed behind him. Peppa was left alone. She knocked, called his name, but there was no answer. A few minutes later, the door opened again. George came out, covered in dust, as if he'd been somewhere ancient. His eyes looked empty. "Where were you?" Peppa asked. He whispered, "There, blue rooms." And a shadow. It's waiting Peppa didn't understand. George went to bed, but all night he tossed and turned, mumbling in his sleep. The next night, it happened again. The blue door appeared once more, and again, only George could open it. Peppa tried to grab his hoof, but her touch passed through the air, as though the door existed only for him. When he returned, his fur was no longer dusty but covered in soot. His eyes glowed faintly with an eerie light. He didn't want to talk. Only sometimes, he whispered, "Labubu is inside." He's watching. Peppa began to notice strange things. The shadows in the corners of the room started to move on their own. The water in the sink looked dark, like a mirror. When she called George, he turned his head slowly, as if unsure who was speaking to him. "George, it's me, your sister," she said quietly. One night, Peppa woke up to the sound of footsteps. George was standing by her bed. His eyes shone with a cold blue light. In them, Peppa saw not their room, but a reflection of rippling water, as if inside his gaze was a river. In that murky water, shapes were moving. Peppa gasped. George smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "He's calling," he whispered. "He wants you to come too." Peppa ran to the bathroom. The blue door was there again, glowing faintly, as if lit from within. Moist air flowed from it, and on the floor shimmered a trembling reflection, like the surface of water. She didn't go closer. She knew if she opened it, she wouldn't come back. The next morning, the door was gone. Only a damp wall remained, and a dark hoofprint mark on the floor. George sat on his bed, calm, as if nothing had happened. "Where were you?" she asked. He smiled. "I'm already home." But when Peppa looked into his eyes, she thought she saw movement behind the reflection of the room, a blue shadow shaped like Labubu, sliding across his pupil before vanishing. Since then, Peppa has never seen the blue door again, but every night, when the house grows too quiet, somewhere deep within the walls, there comes a soft sound, as if someone is turning a blue handle once more. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window. A second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky. Mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees. Watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, spring in the pig family's house began with cleaning. Mummy Pig was washing the windows, Daddy Pig was vacuuming, and Peppa and George were dusting their toys. Everything was cheerful, until suddenly, from below, a strange sound echoed from the basement. It was a dull, scraping noise, like something heavy slowly rolling across the floor. "Daddy, did you hear that?" asked Peppa. Daddy Pig didn't respond, too busy tidying up. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a long rustling. Curiosity took over, and Peppa pulled George by the hand. "Let's go see." Maybe something just fell. They opened the basement door. A wave of damp, dusty air rushed out. The stairs creaked under each step, and the lower they went, the colder it became. In the farthest corner, among old boxes, lay a round object that looked like a tire. It was covered in dust, but beneath the grime, faint wet spots glistened, as if alive. "What's that?" asked George. Peppa stepped closer. Something flickered in the center of the tire. She gasped. It was an eye, large, still, and cloudy, like a frog's. It blinked. The tire shuddered, turned slightly, and Peppa saw that underneath it were human legs, thin and grey, while from the top, emerging out of the shadows, was a frog-like head with a wide mouth and damp, rubbery skin. The creature stood motionless, staring straight at them. George clutched Peppa's hand. "Peppa, what is that?" It didn't move. Only a faint rhythmic whisper came from deep within the basement, as if someone were chanting meaningless words. Ambalabu, ambalabu. Peppa stepped back. We have to go. But the staircase behind them was gone. In its place hung a thick grey mist. The air grew heavy, almost sticky. A thin vapor rose from the tire, spreading around them. The world began to tremble. The floor disappeared beneath their feet, and the walls melted away, turning into clouds of fog. When the trembling stopped, they were no longer at home. Peppa and George stood in an empty space with no ceiling or floor. Glowing shadows floated slowly in the air, as if the objects themselves had come to life. Toys, shelves, furniture, everything drifted weightlessly, like in a dream. And in the middle of that strange void, it appeared again. Boneka Ambalabu. Now it was moving, slowly rolling forward like a living tire, leaving behind a wet trail. Its human legs walked on nothing, and its eyeless gaze gleamed faintly through the fog. The creature tilted its head, and from its mouth came a quiet, drawn-out rasping sound. It was like a melody, the warped tune of an old music box, stretched beyond recognition. I want to go home, whispered George. Peppa looked around. On the ground beside them stood the same music box that started it all. It trembled slightly, as if calling them. Wind it up, said Peppa. George turned the handle. The melody played again, uneven, distorted. The creature twitched, stretched upward, and its outline began to fade into the mist. The world around them glowed with a pale, ghostly light. For a moment, it felt like they were returning. The air thickened, familiar. Through the mist, the shapes of boxes and shelves emerged once more. But when Peppa opened her eyes, they weren't home. The room looked almost the same, but colder, dimmer. Everything seemed drained of color. Mummy? Daddy? Called Peppa. No answer, only the echo of her voice, repeating again and again, softer each time. On the floor sat the music box. It was closed. Peppa approached and touched it. From inside came the same whisper. Ambalabu. She slowly stepped back, holding George's hand. The whisper repeated. Now it came from behind them. They turned. In the shadow of the stairs stood Boneka Ambalabu, still, silent. Only its eyes reflected the faint light, as if waiting for the melody to start again. Rain had been falling all evening. Drops tapped softly against the glass, and Peppa Pig's house was wrapped in a grey twilight. Peppa and George sat on the floor, stacking colourful blocks into a tower. Everything seemed ordinary, until the front door slammed shut. Daddy? Mummy? Peppa called. No answer. Only the sound of wet footsteps echoed through the hallway. Peppa stood up and peeked into the living room. Her parents were standing by the door. At first glance, they looked the same, but something was wrong. Mummy Pig was smiling, yet the smile was frozen, like it had been painted on. Her eyes were dark, without reflection. Daddy Pig moved too smoothly, as if his body slid rather than walked. A chill ran down Peppa's back. You got wet? She asked quietly. Daddy Pig tilted his head. Too far, then farther, and farther still, until it turned completely around. Peppa stepped back, clutching George. Mummy Pig took a step forward, her body bending unnaturally, as if her bones had turned soft. Mummy? George whispered. The answer was a low rasp, almost laughter, but without joy. Peppa grabbed George's hoof and ran upstairs. The boards creaked beneath them, as though the house itself tried to hold them back. The bedroom door slammed shut, and Peppa turned the key. Downstairs, silence returned. Only the rain outside and their quick, frightened breathing. Then came the first sound, a long, scraping noise, like claws on wood. Something was dragging a paw along the door. Then a whisper. At first, faint and muffled, then closer, until it sounded as if voices were speaking right through the keyhole. The shadows on the walls began to move. They pulsed and shifted, changing shape as if alive. One stretched to the ceiling and started crawling toward the bed. Peppa pressed George against herself, eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder. The wood groaned under the weight of unseen claws, and suddenly the darkness burst into two blazing eyes, fiery yellow, unblinking. They pierced the room like light through smoke. From the blackness emerged a massive owl. Its wings were spread wide, its talons long and sharp, its gaze cold and intelligent. It tilted its head, and its hoot sounded like a deep, mocking laugh. The windows rattled from the sound. Peppa shielded George, feeling the owl's shadow stretch across the walls. The creature moved closer to the door, slowly, deliberately. Every touch of its talon left a mark, deep scratches that seemed to melt the wood. The owl leaned toward the keyhole. In the silence came the sound of breathing, heavy and rasping. "Pe, pe," a voice whispered. She couldn't tell whether it was the owl speaking or something else entirely. The door trembled, first gently, then stronger. It seemed ready to crack. The shadows on the walls gathered together, pulling toward a single point. The whole room shivered, and then it stopped. Total silence. Only the rain remained. Peppa didn't move for a long time. Finally, she crept to the door and pressed her ear to it. Nothing. She exhaled slowly and turned to George. He sat motionless, staring into the corner of the room. Peppa followed his gaze and saw it. On the floor, beneath the window, in a small puddle of rainwater, was a single claw print. Outside, the forest loomed dark. Something moved among the trees. Peppa squinted and saw a shape, tall, with vast wings spread wide. It stood silently on a branch, watching. The owl had not left. Peppa opened her eyes in the middle of the night and immediately realized something had changed. Their cozy room looked unfamiliar. The wallpaper was peeling, the ceiling was cracked, and toys were scattered in the dust. George had also woken up and sat on his bed, sobbing softly. "Peppa, this isn't our house," he whispered, clutching his dinosaur. The silence was so thick it rang in their ears. And then it broke. In the living room, the television hummed to life. They both knew no one had turned it on. The screen flickered with static, distorting the darkness of the room. Peppa carefully led her brother by the paw downstairs. The living room looked even worse. The floor was stained with damp spots. The furniture creaked as if it had been standing for hundreds of years. Jagged lines and blurry silhouettes danced across the screen. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa called, but only a distorted, heavy voice replied, "You have been happy for too long. Now it's time to pay." George clapped his hands over his ears in horror, while Peppa stepped closer. Two glowing spots appeared on the screen. One cold blue, the other warm orange. From these patches of light, shapes began to take form. Their bodies looked as though they were built from blocks, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. "It's Los Bros," Peppa whispered. "We've come," they said in unison. Their voices sounded as if they came from both the television and directly inside her head. At that moment, Peppa noticed the mirror on the wall. She looked into it and froze. Staring back at her was herself, but twisted. Her eyes were enormous and black, her mouth stretched into a wide grin, and behind her reflection stood two figures, one blue, one orange. Peppa screamed. George, terrified, ran toward the door and suddenly vanished. His cry echoed through the empty house before silence fell again. "George!" Peppa shouted. She dashed through the rooms, opening every door, but their house was no longer a home. Corridors stretched endlessly, windows looked out into black emptiness. On the floor lay George's dinosaur. The toy was dirty, marked with strange stains, blue and orange prints, as though someone had gripped it with both hands. Peppa's heart pounded. She picked up the toy and heard laughter. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath her. The laughter was childlike and cheerful, yet there was something tortured within it. The television flared again, and now the figures of Los Bros appeared clearly. On the left stood Tralalerit, his aura glowing blue, eyes burning with a cold gleam. His grin was so wide it seemed it might tear his face apart. On the right stood Tung 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 Sito, bathed in orange light. His movements were sharp, his stare piercing, as if he could see straight through her soul. "Where's George?" Peppa cried, though her voice trembled. "He's with us," one answered. "Now it's your turn," added the other. A stream of black smoke burst from the television. It whirled into a vortex, and the entire house began to change. The floor cracked, the walls bent and warped, the ceiling sank lower. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt as heavy as stone. The shadows on the walls came alive, stretching into hands that clawed at her dress. She tore herself free, but standing before her now were Los Bros themselves. No longer on the screen, but in the room. Their blocky bodies seemed alive, yet their eyes were alien. Blue and orange light intertwined, wrapping around everything. Peppa felt her breathing grow heavier, her heart tighten in her chest. "We will play," they said in unison. "Forever." They stepped closer. The floor beneath her feet vanished, and Peppa fell into a crimson void. The last thing she saw were their faces grinning in the darkness, and their hands reaching out to her. And then the house sank into silence. Only in the forest, near their home, one can sometimes hear children's laughter and a faint whisper carrying two voices, one blue, one orange. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window, a second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky. Mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees, watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, it opens. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food. Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him. "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. "I'll count to 100, you hide." Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices. Even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. There were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches. Its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise," whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled, as if 2 more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time, Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words, with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside. It all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her. But the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual. A walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the 3rd day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the 4th day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the 7th day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it, a monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalelo Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. Dancing, laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was Lirili Larilla. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalelo Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Lirili Larilla's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next.